Good evening, everyone, and assalamu alaikum. May the peace and blessings of the Most High be with all of us this evening. We are joined here this evening with four phenomenal panelists to really put into context what we are here to discuss, which is the killing of George Floyd, the aftermath and reflection with Colorado African American leaders. And so I am joined here this evening by Tamara Banks, by Imam Abdur-Rahim Ali, Adrian Miller, Dr. Nabeeh Hassan, and Tay Anderson. And before we kind of start here, I really wanted to talk a little bit about Multicultural Mosaic Foundation, which is the host of tonight's conversation. Multicultural Mosaic Foundation was founded in 2003, and they really believe that as a community, diversity is our strength. We have a great deal to learn from one another, which can enrich ourselves without undermining our own identities. Together, listening and responding with openness and respect, we can move forward in ways that acknowledge genuine differences, but build on shared hopes and values. And so with that being said, the statement that was issued on George Floyd from the Multicultural Mosaic Foundation, I think it's important to kind of share that because this was the background as to why this event came to be. The death of George Floyd, who died while in police custody on Monday, is heartbreaking for the African American community, our nation, and the entire world. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. This incident is further proof that racism and implicit bias continue to plague our nation. The Multicultural Mosaic Foundation condemns the actions by those individuals that led to the death of George Floyd. We must commit ourselves to education, dialogue, compassion, understanding, and peaceful coexistence as we work to end the inherent hatred that is born from ignorance, misunderstanding, and fear. We must use this moment to come together for the cause of freedom and justice so that no person will live in fear because of the color of their skin, their ethnic background, their race, their views, who they love, or who they pray to. We call on all to have courage in the face of fear, to come together in the spirit of love, brotherhood, and sisterhood as we stand against racism, bigotry, and hatred. Together, we must reaffirm our dedication to freedom and justice for all. Powerful statement that really sets the mood for why we are really here today. I mean, today is really a conversation about the murder of George Floyd, but it's even larger than that as we reflect on Breonna Taylor's life who was taken, as well as Ahmaud Arbery. And to really begin this conversation, I want to really invite the panelists that we have here today to really begin this with sharing what are their immediate reflections given all that's been happening. And we do recognize that what is going on in the Black American community is something that cannot be comprehended by anybody other than the Black American community. And so I recognize that as a non-Black person of color. And so I really do thank you all for welcoming me into this space to help facilitate tonight's conversation. To begin the conversation, I'd really like to invite the powerful Tamara Banks, who is a freelance journalist, documentary filmmaker, and media trainer, focusing on social justice and dedicated to creating transformational social change through excellence in journalism. Her background and her work have been included on media platforms such as PBS, CNN, ABC News, HDNet's World Report, BBC, Jazeera America, W2 News, and Fox News. All around, journalism is definitely her cup of tea, to say the least. And so Tamara, please, we would love to hear some of your reflections and your thoughts given tonight's topic.
Nadeen, thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and let me thank all of my fellow panelists. Great to see you virtually. Unfortunately, to see you in this particular topic. And it's a topic that never seems to go away. What is fascinating to me that I've heard in recent days and past couple of weeks is that I'm hearing a lot of people say, wow, racism is really picking up again. Racism in America never stopped. Let us be clear about that. Let me take a few steps back. I know we're talking about George Floyd. I'm currently based and living in Atlanta, and in February, a 25-year-old man was jogging through a suburb in a town called Brunswick, Georgia, about 4.5 miles southeast of Atlanta. And two officers, off-duty officers, police officers, white, took it upon themselves to get in the back of a pickup truck with their rifles and chase after this young man. As you all know, it ended deadly for Ahmaud Arbery. And so after the community and the state and really the nation still on its heels from that, which by the way, no one was arrested until May, keeping that in mind. All of the nation and the community was still reeling and on its heels when the incident happened a little over a week ago now with Mr. George Floyd. And again, I'm stunned that people think that racism just started recently in the past 24 hours or 2 weeks, or really since 2016. Let us be clear that lynching is continuing into the 21st century. What we do know about the case with George Floyd is that the police officers, all of them, have now been arrested and charged. And the first officer that was arrested, Chavez, his charges have gone up to from third degree murder to second degree. So in some regards, there is some progress. But I would also like to point out that this is something that my parents, my father, my grandparents have dealt with when they were young. I do not know one Black man in my life, be it my brother, my husband, my cousins, my father, my colleagues, who have not been harassed at the very least by white officers. And in some of those cases, even Black officers. So what we need to start thinking about in terms of the why in this space is knowing where the history comes from with the police departments. Typically, police departments back in the day were officers recruited out of the KKK. So when you have a mindset that hasn't ever really been changed and moved forward and updated and changed, that permeates generation after generation after generation. And what we all need to know and realize too is that the whole world is watching us. We have prided ourselves as Americans in thinking and believing, and it's true in many cases, that we are the people, the country that everybody aspires to be, the land of the free and the brave. Well, you sure as heck better be brave to go out at a certain time of night if you're African American in this country. The United Nations in the past few days, the human rights chief last Thursday condemned the killing of 46-year-old George Floyd while in police custody. So I think where we are now, to wrap up my opening statements, is we are in a moment. The protests, the rallies, the riots, the praying, the crying, the tears, the holding of hands, the pushing back is a moment where we all need this moment, particularly Black Americans need this moment. But we have to get to a point where we transition and turn this moment into a movement. So I'm anxious to be a part of that, especially as a journalist, in telling this story about how we move from this moment into a movement.
Thank you, Tamara. If I may ask one question, I really appreciated how you really framed that when you talked about the moment into the movement. How does that build on what the moment that was created back in 2016 with Ferguson and the start of Black Lives Matter and the push, and that has never ended. If anything, that has been further amplified by the killing of George Floyd. And so do you feel that's the movement that's going to be continuously amplified, or are we talking about something even much larger than that type of movement?
Well, I think that was the beginning of movement. And I think you raised an interesting point about 2016. When I cover the White House or do stories on President Trump, I have the utmost respect. As an American, a Black American, I also am very much aware of how his policies and his administration see different Americans differently. And so But I want to be clear that racism in America didn't start when President Trump was elected. And so what it did was, while we had 8 years previously of a Black American and a Black family in the White House, Pennsylvania Avenue, and admired and respected throughout the world, in some sense, we were in a false sense of security. So then what happened in 2016 is that the curtain of racism and misogyny and homophobia was pulled back. And so you can't clean an infected wound, and this wound being racism and the others I just mentioned, you can't clean it out until it's exposed and gets air. And so that did start in 2016, I believe. And it started with the Black Lives Matter movement was part of that as well. And so this movement doesn't happen overnight, over a few months, or even a year. It takes, a few years of building to be able to really move the needle. And I think we're in that space now.
Certainly agreed. I really want to bring in one of our panelists, Imam Abdur-Rahim Ali, who has, I personally have witnessed a lot of your activism and your involvement in addressing xenophobia and racism, as well as Islamophobia, and in many different forms. And so Imam Ali, it's really great to have you here with us. Imam Abdur-Rahim Ali is the resident Imam of Northeast Denver Islamic Center, also known as Masjid Taqwa in Denver, Colorado, and the co-chair of the Greater Denver Interfaith Alliance. He has been an Imam for 20 years, formerly the Imam of the Evanston Islamic Center in Evanston, Illinois. Throughout, Imam Ali has associated with the leadership of Imam Dean Muhammad, who was his mentor. Imam Ali is a frequent speaker on Islam around the country and was honored to speak at interfaith service at the Democratic Convention and the historic breakfast honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s speech, I Have a Dream speech. Imam Ali also contributes his time to the Colorado Imam Council, Colorado Muslim Leadership Council, and the Detroit National Annual Muslim Convention Committee. He's also an honorary board member of World Denver. Imam Abdur-Rahim Ali, it's really great to have you here with us this evening. And I would really like to hear, and the audience also would like to hear, just further expanding on a lot of the points that Tamara has brought to us about the fact that racism has always ever been present. If anything, it's only being filmed now, or it's only gaining a greater movement in terms of people responding to it and wanting to put an end to it.
Well, I agree with Tamara, and firstly, with God's name, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer, racism is to America as apple pie. It's ingrained. It's in the very culture and structure of America. It's in the genes of America, and so we have to address it as such. For me, coming up on the south side of Chicago and having witnessed my mother coming back from the funeral of Emmett Till as a child, and saw the hurt that I've never seen my mother that upset after coming back from a funeral. And I was 4 or 5 years old, but it had an indelible mark in my consciousness and brain. And having been in many marches and demonstrations in the 60s, we see that some things have changed, but some things are still the same. And this is an opportunity, I think, now for humanity to really come together and get some things done properly. Having the people who are in leadership who have the right conduct and character, which we don't have right now in terms of the president and some of the other leaders in Washington, D.C. We have to demand that we have people with the right character and conduct in political office. So we have to make sure that happens. Now, I'm a preacher, so I'm trying to keep this to 3 or 4 minutes, okay? So pull my coat if I'm going too long, all right? But this racism has been ingrained into American culture and psyche. And the disrespect that has been shown to the African American community has been going on for over 400 years here in this country. And it goes even further back than that in terms of racism. If you know anything about scripture, you know, Christians, Jesus healed the lepers. And leprosy is actually a reference to racism. And we know Muhammad the Prophet, the prayers and the peace be upon him, in his last sermon, he talked about the racism, that there's no superiority of an Arab over a non-Arab or a black over white. Superior one is the one who has the most obedient to God and has the best character. So it's been an issue for a long time, and we have to address the root causes of it in order to get the solutions that's needed for us to go forward as the human community. Because now this is people are protesting all over the world about this. So it's been an issue all along, and we hope that we can get to the root causes of it and come up with the solution.
Jazakumullah khair, Imam Ali, for your thoughts and reflections there. I think on this note of how the dimension of spirituality and faith weaves itself into this conversation, I'd really like to invite our next panelist, who is Adrian Miller. And Adrian Miller is a food writer, attorney, and certified barbecue judge. Adrian, we're gonna have to get some tips from you, I think, on another conversation around that. Who lives in Denver, Colorado. I have to say, you have quite the fascinating background. Adrian received an AB in International Relations from Stanford University in 1991 and a JD from Georgetown University Law Center in 1995. He's currently the executive director of the Colorado Council of Churches, and as such is the first African American and first layperson to hold that position. He previously served as a special assistant to President Bill Clinton with his initiative for One America, the first freestanding office in the White House to address issues of racial, religious, and ethnic reconciliation, and was also a senior policy analyst for Colorado Governor Bill Ritter Jr. Adrian, please, we would really love to hear your reflections and your thoughts around this, especially given the multiple dimensions that your professional background has included.
Yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate having this opportunity to share my thoughts with all of these great people. So I start off by thinking about my father, my 80-year-old father, Jaime Miller, who grew up in the segregated South in rural Arkansas, at a time when if you were a Black person, you couldn't look a white person in the eye without asking for trouble. And I talked to him Sunday for dinner, and I asked him, what do you think about what's going on right now? And he said, in the 1960s, after all that civil rights legislation was passed, I never thought that I would see things get this bad. So I'm seeing the dreams of my own father being dashed right now. And then for myself, when I look at George Floyd, I see myself. I know that it could have easily been me in a similar circumstance, only because of my skin color. And as much as this country affords the joy of opportunity and reaching your potential, it's just, I have to carry around a sadness because I know that so many people have not gotten the opportunities that I've gotten, that I think about the pain and evil visited upon my ancestors in this country and how many dreams have been dashed and deferred because of racism. And I think about how it just sickens so many aspects of our society, our democratic institutions, the church. I'm part of the Christian faith tradition, and I know that the body of Christ is broken because of race. And I spend a lot of time thinking about how can I bring my talents to address that situation. But I want to end by just thinking about the dreams of Gianna Floyd, who is George Floyd's daughter, who recently said, "My daddy changed the world." And so maybe in this moment, we can actually live out her dream, bring those words to fruition, and change the world. We have a chance to do it. We've had many chances to do it before. We've fallen short, but we got to press on so that we can make a change really happen, substantive change, dealing with systemic racism, dealing with the ways that so many aspects of our society affect African Americans, and then also getting to just people, getting to the point where white people, whoever you are, don't feel like you have the privilege and power to restrain what I'm doing, to hold me down. So those are the things I've been thinking about.
Thank you so much, Adrian. And I think one of the really main purposes of this conversation here this evening is really to also receive your guidance and your insight, all as panelists here, about how do we have that conversation with white people in our community, so that way we can address that fact of, as you said, not feeling like they have that privilege of that power over communities of color, certainly. I would really like to bring into the conversation now another panelist, someone that I also call my older brother and dearly respect in every sense around that as well. I'd like to invite Dr. Nabeeh Hassan. He's the co-director of the Colorado Muslim Speakers Bureau, which is an affiliate of the Islamic Networks Group. He is active in speaking and facilitating interfaith efforts, youth development, and training speakers. Nabeeh is also a biomedical researcher at National Jewish Health, specializing in genomics of infectious lung diseases. I also know that you've been contributing to a lot of the research that has been going on around COVID-19 and how our communities need to continuously be safe. So thank you for your work in that regard as well. Through speaking about Islam, health, and science, Nabeeh has given hundreds of presentations to primary schools, universities, churches, hospitals, and professional societies. He currently lives in Denver, Colorado, and take it away, Nabeeh. I would really love to hear some of your thoughts and reflections.
Thank you. Thank you for the very generous introduction, Sister Nadeen. Thank you, fellow panelists, for joining us this evening, and thank you, Mosaic, for really kind of stepping up and trying to engage in a very difficult conversation in some tumultuous times. When I think about kind of what's going on in the chronology of events that happened, I've got to give the context that, as a Muslim, I was in Ramadan. I was steeped in the most bizarre circumstance of our lifetimes, where we're fasting in complete isolation, afraid of each other. And then this story comes about with Brother Ahmed being chased down while jogging, minding his own business by two unarmed police officers, as Tamara mentioned. Then we have the other death where the woman was killed in her apartment. And then Mr. Floyd was murdered in front of a crowd of individuals with 4 police officers involved with his death. And I think about responsibility. With responsibility that's been given to leadership, you are held to a higher standard. Each officer who carries a badge, who gets a gun to serve and protect us, carries an immense amount of responsibility, and thus they're held to a higher standard. For individuals who couldn't have the moral fortitude to talk to their colleague and say, hey, this is too much, they gotta go. When we have institutions that insulate that kind of abjugation of responsibility and leadership, that's got to go. We can't have systems in place that allow people to be bystanders and not have the moral fortitude to do what's right. I think about the responsibility of this nation that brought millions of people against their will to this country, kept them here, stripped them of their very essence, their language, their culture, their faith. There's a responsibility that goes with that. There is a debt that's been garnered, and there's a debt to be paid. That's responsibility. When we have presidents, when we have mayors, when we have leaders who want to bring us into a kumbaya situation, there's a failure of leadership to recognize the very history that you guys have mentioned before. I think back to Detroit, where my parents met, my dad's from, and I think about one of the most horrific racial riots in our country's history. The racial riots of 1967, in which Detroit burned. People don't understand now because Detroit is the butt of jokes, but Detroit was arguably the greatest city in the world in that time. And the racial, tumultuous uncertainty of the 60s made the white community in Detroit very scared. And the very same civil unrest was going on, except the National Guard and military were called in, and the city burned, people were shot. And I say, did our leadership not learn anything? Are we still repeating the same old things from the 60s? Are we still facing the same problems from 50 and 60 years ago? You know, as Sister Nadeen mentioned, I'm a geneticist. This is in our DNA. And until we face this disease, this original sin of America, genocide and racism, we are continuously going to keep repeating these cycles. So I'm stuck on responsibility, but I'm also wanting it, as many of you have mentioned, wanting that responsibility to transition to aspiration. Let's develop actual tangible plans. Let's develop an agenda to move forward and make systemic institutional changes. I know many of our critics will say you had affirmative action that didn't work. Okay, we failed, but that doesn't mean that we stopped trying. There's clearly an ailment in our country. And if we don't fix it, the world is watching, and they are as sure as the night comes after the day that we are going to tear each other apart. And there won't be a United States left. So we've got to fix this. And there's no time like the present. Let's not let these deaths happen in vain. Let's come together. Let's call on our allies. Let's call in every chip that we have. Let's set an agenda and let's push forward.
Thank you, and Jazakumullah khair, Dr. Hassan, for those thoughts and reflections. And I think something that really resonated was when you talked about the sense of responsibility and the transition to aspiration. And I think, you know, with a lot of the conversations that are currently happening, I've been seeing in communities how, you know, everyone is talking about the protests that are going on. Everyone is talking about what's happening in Minneapolis right now. Everyone's talking about how is the global community responding. Everyone is talking about reflecting on their own communities. As a member of the Arab Palestinian community, we're talking about reflecting on anti-Black sentiments within our own communities. The entire community has, I believe the entire global community has woken up in its many different sectors. And so in speaking about that aspect of responsibility and a movement to aspiration, I would really like to hear if you all are willing to share that. What are your aspirations given the context of what we are now? And then I would really like us to see then, once we have a sense of those aspirations, then to come back to the responsibility aspect of it and really have a message for viewers about what roles can we play around this and what responsibilities do we have as benefactors of these systemic racisms that have benefited us, and in some ways for some communities has also disenfranchised them. So whoever would ever like to take that first. Go ahead, Adrian.
Can I just jump in real quick, Adrian? I'm on deadline, so I
Oh, yes, please, Tamara.
I didn't want to just leave. I know this is being recorded. I know you'll post it so that not only I can benefit from everything that these esteemed, smart people and wise individuals will be sharing, but the rest of the world that's watching live right now and will watch this on tape. So thank you so much for including me in this important conversation, and I'll see you in the movement.
Peace.
Thank you so much for being with us here, Tamara. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here, and we really do appreciate all the work that you are continuously doing. And I'm sure that we will continue hearing from you across the different journalist platforms that you continue to contribute to.
Yeah, so just to jump in on your question, I think of two things that I aspire to right now. One is to change the laws that are applicable, the ones that are really fomenting systemic racism and other things that are keeping Black people down. We even have stuff now happening in a Colorado state legislature, which I think is going to make a difference. And hopefully we see things like that all across the country. And this may sound a little weird, but I would like to be an ally to any white people who really want to address this issue with other white people, because I think one of the key breakthroughs that we're going to have as a society is if white people really try to understand what's going on, and then talk amongst each other about how to bring change. And I'd like to just share one quick anecdote. Someone I know was really disturbed by what's going on, and she just basically said, hey, I want to get other white mothers with kids, together. I'm going to be in a park at this time in this place. Let's come and talk about it. And a number of people showed up, and she kind of cataloged what they discussed and shared that broadly. I'd love to see more things like that happen.
Thank you, Adrian. Imam Ali or Dr. Hassan, would you all like to share what your aspects of aspirations look like?
Imam Ali, you're muted.
There we go. For me, I think establishing a model community that can give people a sense of what can be done as we try to establish moral character and moral strength in this country, because the leadership has failed us. The leadership in this country has been without moral strength and character and courage, lacking courage to stand up for what is right. And bottom line is they've been bought and paid for. That's the only way I can describe it. In terms of this particular demonstrations that have been going on, I know from experience, had not the Caucasian youth in particular, had they not showed up to the demonstration, a lot of bodily harm would have happened to the African American community. But they couldn't do it because there was too many Caucasians there, and I'm sure they got calls from some of their mothers and fathers that said, don't shoot, don't just open fire. Otherwise, it could have been a mass slaughter. I'm very, very aware of that and concerned about that. And we hear the deafening silence from people in leadership. They're not speaking out. They're not saying anything. They're quiet. And ordinarily, they have something to say, but they're quiet, and silence is complicity. In this particular atmosphere and environment, if you're silent, you're complicit. You're a part of the problem. And so I think those are the things that come to mind for me. because, like I said earlier, in Chicago, in the Democratic Convention in Chicago, there was a police riot. It was a police riot. The police were so amped up and ready for the protesters who were coming from all over the country to the Democratic Convention until just before the convention and the protesters were there, they were rioting. The police rioted. So we know that that's a definite possibility, particularly with the leadership that we have on Pennsylvania Avenue. So we have to be aware of that. We have to make sure those who are in positions of leadership in government that didn't stand up, who didn't speak out, that we remove them from office. So we have to make sure that everybody votes. We have to make sure everybody votes. They have to go.
Jazakumullah khair, Imam Ali. Dr. Hassan, what are your aspirations?
Well, I know it might be hard for some people, but the first aspiration is when you see my Black body somewhere, don't assume that I don't belong there. That's the first thing. I am sick and tired of being sick and tired about my Blackness and my presence being questioned. Whether I'm waiting for the train to come home from a Rockies game, whether I'm going into my office at my hospital, I shouldn't be questioned that I don't belong there. You know, my credentials stack up just the same as anyone else. I can't tolerate walking into a grocery store wearing a suit and some woman snatches her purse thinking I'm going to steal from her. I don't need your money. I have my own. That is a simple aspiration of just recognizing my humanity, first and foremost, not my skin color, not what you think you've seen on an episode of Cops or some terrible movie that you want to say all Black people, you know, are criminals and violent. No, not this brother. That's a simple aspiration. Number one, it's just recognize the dignity and humanity of other people that you come in contact with. Don't assume things about people. I mentioned responsibility. Take responsibility and ownership of the discomfort and all that trash that you've been taught your whole life. You know, when people encounter you and they think, wow, you don't see that every day. You don't see a, you know, Stanford graduate, Georgetown graduate every day, huh, Adrian? Isn't that funny? Yeah. Where'd you do your training at? You know, time out for that. We are scholars. Our last president, Mr. Barack Hussein Obama, you know, was the president of his law review. He and his wife, Michelle Obama, were like, I still can't imagine how in 2019, 2020, the 21st century, people still hang on to these vestiges of coonery and nonsense that are from an era long forgone. You know, people need to understand and take responsibility to know the history of Black people in America. We've had great things before we came to America. We had great things here in America, and we will continue to have great things. Look up Black Wall Street, people. Understand the domestic terrorism that some individuals' ancestors perpetrated against Black communities in this country. Look up the idea and understanding of what a picnic is. You know, like there's some heinous things that this country has in its history, and they have to take responsibility for it. So that's an aspiration that I have, is understanding your own mess before you come looking at mine. Recognizing my human dignity and the humanity in fellow man, and establishing that allyship. We got people who's laying their bodies on the line, and we got just as many people, as Imam Ali said, as quiet as church mice, scared to even share a post or a hashtag. That's the least you can do for a brother or sister or someone that you met in your life. We all know those folks who are quick to say, I'm not racist. I know Johnny. He's my buddy. Where are you at now for Johnny? You could at least put a hashtag on his name. You know, say, I stand with you. You know, we've all had countless phone calls and text messages from our friends and our loved ones and our colleagues, you know, checking in on us, feeling how we are. I love it. But advocate for that systemic change too. We want more leadership. We want more institutional policies that guarantee fairness in positions of power in this country. You can't tell me that this kind of stuff will be happening in police institutions when we have actual impartial assessment over police tactics. So when we have citizens as well as the police themselves policing their actions, you can't tell me that these kind of things wouldn't be going on anymore. We have to take responsibility. And again, that's something that I'm hopeful for. I see a lot of the youth taking steps towards responsibility. I'm hoping that their moms and dads, their aunties and uncles and grandparents also take similar strides as well.
Please go ahead, Adrian.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, just in terms of an aspiration, and this is comic in a very tragic sense, but y'all, please stop calling the police on us when we're just doing mundane, everyday activities. Just stop,
yeah.
Please.
Right. Yeah, we done with that.
And then Dr. Hassan, since you had said you have your own money, my other aspiration is to borrow some from you at some point, but we'll get to that later.
Hey, you know, Masjid Taqwa and you know, in our interfaith work is near and dear to my heart. It's near and dear to my heart.
For sure. Imam Ali, did you have something?
Yeah, I just thought about that $20 bill, this counterfeit $20 bill. And I'm sure that kind of fake money has passed through many people's hands. I know it's happened to me. I didn't know I had a fake $20 bill till the bank told me. So that has happened. It can happen to anybody. But for someone to lose their life over a fake $20 bill, it's just unconscionable. You know, so we have to speak out against those things. But I'm my focus is, most of my focus is on establishing model community life and attainable, affordable housing. We don't have enough, particularly with the gentrification that's taking place in our neighborhoods. So I'm laser focused on that, but I'm not forgetting about the importance of education. I'm not forgetting about the importance of economics and business. I'm not forgetting about the importance of culture and health. And I'm not forgetting about the importance of government. So all those things, we have to make sure that we play our part in establishing those things. And I'm getting a little long in the tooth. So, you know, we want to give as much information and knowledge that we've accumulated with God's help to those who are coming behind us.
Certainly. Thank you. I think I'm learning a lot in this process as well. So I really do appreciate you all sharing that. And I think, you know, I would really like to hear, you know, we talked a lot about systemic change and we talked a lot about institutionalizing policies. And Adrian, I'd like to go back to the Colorado state legislation that you talked about that Representative Harold is one of the sponsors on. And I was hoping that you can give a little bit of context about what is the purpose of that type of legislation that is being proposed, as some of the viewers are having questions about that, as they have not heard of it yet. So I was hoping you can provide us a little bit of insight on that.
Yeah, I don't have too much details on it. So what I will say broadly is the idea is just to codify police accountability in so many ways. So I haven't been able to see the whole bill, so I'm sorry that I can't give a lot of details, but Representative Harrod is a very sharp, very communicative about what she's doing. So I'm sure that details of that will come out. But that's the kind of change we need, because now we know that norms are not enough to deter this kind of conduct. So we need to have things codified in law. We need to have leaders that will enforce the law. And then we need the public citizenry to be vigilant and to hold our officials accountable at all levels to make sure that these laws are in place and that they're being enforced. So part of that is, like Imam Ali said, we, as whacked as our system is, as many problems as our system has, we still have power. Our voice counts, because if we show up and vote, we can actually affect change. One thing that I hope that comes out of the current situation is that people are engaged in our democratic institutions, and they are seeking multiple ways in order to bring change. And I think the fact that we have people in the legislature, people in power right now who can make things happen, should embolden and encourage all of us.
Certainly. And Adrian, I do have a particular question that came specifically from the audience towards you, actually. The Armenian community in Colorado, as you may have noticed, because you made a Facebook share about this, recently took note of the post share that you made about the Colorado State Capitol Armenian Genocide Memorial vandalism that happened. That during the midst of these demonstrations, it's not understood who actually did it, and we do understand the fact that there are white supremacist groups that have infiltrated these demonstrations to further exacerbate a lot of the damage that is going on. And so the community was really shocked to see that in the midst of the killing of George Floyd and the amount of energy and things of that sort that is being called on by the Black community right now, whether it be to around education, whether it be to guide allies and things of that sort, you found time to share that message and to express a sense of solidarity within the Armenian community. And the question that now lies is, why do that at this time when it seems like absolute focus and 110% focus should be on the Black community and addressing these underlying root causes of racism and the need for systemic change?
Well, the short answer is we're all in this together. And I believe that we should love one another, and the plight of others is my plight. And that was an opportunity for me as a person of color, but not part of that community, to show allyship. And one thing that I was really struck by in that statement put out by the Armenian community is that they were actually able to show nuance. They just said, hey, we know that this does not speak to the people who are trying to address systemic racism and the death of George Floyd. Basically, they were saying to everybody, look, don't get distracted by this stuff. This is horrible what happened, but keep your eyes on the ball. And the main problem is this. And I just thought that they were showing allyship to me. And so I wanted to send some love back.
Thank you for sharing that, Adrian. And going to kind of take it from that point there, where we're really talking about that the eye on the ball, as you said, is really to be focused on systemic change. I think, Dr. Hassan, you talked about how non-Black folks contribute to the causes of racism through their implicit biases, through the way that they see you and your Blackness, and the different aspects of life that you exist in. I think, Imam Ali, you really talked about the need for moral strength and character, and how that there's a lack of it in society right now. And that's why we continue to see this perpetual racism present itself around different communities. And so I think the next question that really comes, which has been something that you all have been highlighting, is really, what does responsibility look like? We talked about aspects of voting, we talked about education, we talked about communities looking inward at their own anti-Black sentiments. We talked about the fact that demonstrations, Imam Ali, you mentioned this, demonstrations didn't get quite the brutal response from police because of the fact that there were white bodies there. And they were able to mitigate that bit, leveraging the racist systems that currently exist that allow them to do so. So we would love to hear some of your responses on, like, what does responsibility look like to you all from allyship of the non-Black community?
Well, we definitely need allies. We're all in this together. We're all humans, and that's what we have to remember. That's what unites us, is that we're human beings. So we have the same aspirations as other human beings have. When we see, this is one of the reasons why we're close to the Palestinian cause. Is they've been going through this for what, 70, 75 years with occupation, etc., and oppression. And we've been going through it for 401 years now. Okay, so we have to put that in context. But we are very sensitive to others who've been oppressed. We see what's happening in Syria, where their country has been completely destroyed and demolished. And other places around the world, in Africa. We can go on and on. So there's a kinship with human beings, particularly those who have been under oppression. And we have a modern day pharaoh in the White House right now, who's a white supremacist. He took that photo out. We've seen the photo just similar to that was taken by Adolf Hitler, with the Bible in his hand, just like Trump. And we know that what he was about, white supremacy and Nazism. And so this was really just a sign to Trump's base. They knew what that meant. They knew exactly what that meant. So we have to be conscious of that. But we cannot let ourselves be distracted. And anytime you're demonstrating, you always have an element that's there. They have their own agenda. When I was in demonstrations, you would sometimes, matter of fact, I found out later the guy that was right next to me that was saying, "Right on, power to the people, Black power." He was a police informant. And you had other people who were anarchists in that crowd. There are only a very, very small, tiny amount of people that are like that, but they can influence some of the other people in the crowd if they're not careful. So you have to be conscious and careful when you're doing these things, because you have Malcolm X's bodyguard was the police. Fred Hampton's bodyguard was the police. And both of them were assassinated. We can go on and on and on. This has been a pattern in the history in America, and it hasn't stopped. The residue of J. Edgar Hoover, we still have some of that present today. It's still there. And we're still fighting with the plantation ghost that's in our subconscious mind. We're dealing with 400 years plus of PTSD, post-traumatic slave disorder. That's what we're dealing with. In addition to what's going on in terms of white supremacy and racism, all of that. So we have to be conscious of that. But we have to keep our eyes on the solution and establishing model community life.
I guess let me listen up a little bit. For my allies out there, and I'll talk about white allyship and then non-white people of color allyship as kind of two different things. But they both fall a bit, or both groups suffer from one thing that, you know, has been a disease that affects the world, And it's this idea of its proximity to whiteness. So the closer you are to white, the more acceptable, the more comfortable, the more appropriate it is. You've seen this as groups have immigrated into the United States. You know, you had the First Nations people who were not white.
On Zoom.
You had the white European settlers who've come, the African slaves. Europeans tried East Indian slavery as well. That didn't work. They tried to enslave Native Americans. That didn't work either. And then every group that's come after that. And you have the history of, well, Italians aren't white, Greek aren't white. But slowly but surely, those groups all get brought into the fold to continue the myth of white superiority, to continue and propagate this myth of white superiority because you're in the group. Same has happened, unfortunately, with our Arab brothers and sisters, as well as our Desi, our East Indian brothers and sisters. Unfortunately, when traumatic events in our nation's history happen, global geopolitical events, 9/11, Iraq, you know, any of those kind of events happen, those groups get reminded just how not white they are. And so there's this yo-yo effect that happens between Black, you know, liberation, Black progressive thought, and non-Black communities of color that are struggling with similar issues of post-colonial effects of quasi, you know, similitude racism, if you will. You have to own those things. And it's super uncomfortable because the communities do not want to admit, even though there's skin bleaching cream that's sold, there's contact lenses and the fawning over kids that have blonde hair and blue eyes from some of these groups, it's internalized racism. And until people own that that's a part of their trauma, their post-colonial trauma, they won't ever really be effective allies. So in non-Black communities of color, there has to be an admission that the vestiges of colonialism, European colonialism, are still affecting them to this day. And you're never going to really be an appropriate ally when that white superiority thinking and mentality is so deeply entrenched in your culture. Because you're always going to assume, what was Mr. Floyd doing? What was he doing to have the cop arrest him in the first place? Why was he there? He must have been doing something wrong. This assumption of Blackness as wrong has to change. And that will never change when you have an internalized white superiority or inferiority complex for some communities. Very much similar for white communities, there has to be an admission that we are part and parcel and benefiting from this system that has been set up over the last several hundred years. I would not be where I am today, you know, George Washington Smith or Preston Howell III, without the racist, you know, advantages that my ancestors had. And that I benefit from that. Even though I never owned a slave, I still benefit from all the systems that were built upon that slavery, that were taking advantage of people in Jim Crow era, that took advantage and made monumental monetary gains in redlining and allowed people to gain immense wealth while other people were prohibited from that. Individuals in those communities have to understand that they did not get to where they are from their own merit. They had hundreds of years of a head start. Their competition was shackled with chains. Like, you have to understand those things, as discomforting as that fact is, that is an indelible aspect to where we are in 2020. And until you wash those kind of things out of your brain, you're going to struggle to be an effective ally to Black liberation and progress for the Black community, both in the United States as well as around the world. So my aspiration is for people to fully understand and grasp the vestiges of the pervasive, you know, I don't know what word accurately describes the evil that was put out throughout the world so many hundreds of years ago to distribute this anti-Black sentiment throughout the world from sea to shining sea. You can go anywhere in the world and find that. And How? It was exported and consumed from European distributors all the way into each community that they colonized.
Go ahead, Adrian.
So yeah, just a couple of other thoughts that I had. One way that people can help, one way that people can help is just to listen and understand that the Black community is not monolithic. So they may get different answers than they were expecting, but just to listen and be present and affirm the humanity of that person who's expressing their pain or whatever they're feeling in that moment. We talked about engaging politically, support people who express values, at least public policy values that'll lead to the change that we need. And, do what you can where you are. I'm taking that from my good friend, Tony Tipton Martin. We all have different gifts, so we have to find our place. But if you have the willingness to bring about change, that's a great start. And so I would just encourage people to figure out, and I'm in many ways still trying to figure out what is my place in this movement? How can I best help change the current situation? So I don't have all the answers, but what I do is I just try to listen to others and try to create a shared future, something that we can build together.
Hey, Timmy.
Certainly. I think in really talking, we have quite a few viewers that are educators. And so a lot of the things that we've been discussing have been about root causes and the fact that a number of people are just not aware of the privileges that they carry because they've never had to worry about them. And that makes them a privilege in themselves. And we talked about the history of this country in many different ways. And the fact that our education system, without a doubt is engineered and crafted in a way to push out a certain national myth for the best interests of those in power. And so for the educators on the call, what advice would you have for them? Especially in educators in K through 12 whom are instilling education within the next generation of leaders, within the next generation of youth and everything of that sort. What advice do you have to them in order to challenge that national myth that continues to be instituted in public and private schools throughout the nation?
I'll jump in. I can't tell them to ditch the textbooks because we have all those standardized tests and evaluations for educators. But what I will say is try to involve as many real people as you can. If you can bring in a guest speaker to augment your curricula, to really personify issues, to make it a real person, that is far more impactful, particularly with young people who are very much visual and tactile. Using different kinds of projects and resources like the 1619 project, where it's not, it is a project that's rooted in the concept and institution of slavery, but it talks about how this institution of slavery has tentacles throughout the entire essence of the United States. And it's done in a very sound story, visual element that really hits on different learning styles. Although it would take some work for educators to bring that down to a younger child's level, certainly high school individuals and college students, this would be more than appropriate for them. But again, personifying these issues, it really hits home when it's a person that you tie an issue to as opposed to an abstract concept. That would be my best recommendation. So trying to bring real people into your classroom and personifying these issues we've mentioned.
Yeah, and also we have to change the history books. The history books have to be changed. What do you think is going to happen when you start the history of African Americans with enslavement? So this is just supporting and promoting white supremacy and keeping it in existence, with no mention of what happened before we were kidnapped and brought here. The pyramids that we built, We can go on and on, mathematics, science, etc. No mention of that, just enslavement on. So we have to get the education that's needed, not just for the African American community. This is for the entire population. They need to know that history. They need to know the history of with the contributions that we have made to world society. And if we don't have that, then we're gonna have a problem. We're having a problem now.
I think I would add, if educators can find a way to teach critical thinking skills, teach their students how to ask the right questions so they're not sleepwalking through life. I didn't really get critical thinking skills really until college, and then more so in law school. But one of the best classes that I've ever had looked at World War I from various theoretical frameworks and said, okay, how do you explain World War I through economics? How do you explain it through domestic politics? How do you explain it through foreign policy? And that just opened up a whole world. And I just think if we can teach people how to think critically and ask the right questions, it expands the opportunities for learning, and I think can create the right mindset.
Certainly. Thank you so much for providing your insights on that. You know, we've been talking about, you've all been sharing a lot of about the different ways that you are impacting our relative communities, and how that shaped your experience as a Black person navigating those different areas. And I want to go back to something that you said earlier, Nabeeh, and that has been highlighted in different ways, is we've been talking about the need for tangible plans and this type of agenda. You know, Tamara started off the conversation saying that we are in a moment, and this moment needs to be transformed into a movement. And that movement needs to be dedicated to Black liberation, to ending the systemic racism and the injustices in all the variety of forms that it continues to exist. And only then can we have systemic institutional change. There's a lot of information going out there. Adrian, you highlighted that the Black community is not a monolith by any means. There's different aspirations, there's different desires, there's different means of going about it. For people that are allies, how do they find those different types of tangible plans and that agenda to align with and to move forward? And do they carry any responsibility to add to those tangible plans? Or is it the Black community that fully leads in this? And so I would really love to hear your perspectives on this.
Interesting. I encourage people to get uncomfortable. So I often, and my friends know, I love uncomfortable conversations. I love talking with people who disagree with me, who are diametrically opposed with me. And in order to accomplish these aspirations that we have, we're going to have to talk to a whole lot of people who don't care about Black liberation or Black, equality. They don't care about those things. We have to convince just enough of them to get these things through. So the responsibility of the majority community is, if we're all talking about people who are moral, just-minded, equity-seeking individuals, it is their responsibility to seek these conversations out, as uncomfortable as they may be. Our responsibility is to partake, to be partners, negotiate, because these are all going to be very tough negotiations. But in the end, coming out of this with a better deal. Coming out of this with a better deal for our civic discourse and our lives in society. So people coming out into the public square, talking and discussing about issues as controversial, as uncomfortable as they may be, and really coming to task using logic and reason to come to a better state of affairs. This is going to involve politicians. It's going to involve local leaders. This is going to have to be something at a national, not a national, but a local level that goes up. I was, kind of misinformed as a younger person. It's not national and down, it's local and up. And we're going to have to support legislation like, Sister Harad's, legislation. We're going to have more people. We're going to have to develop a lot more young individuals who are legislators or council persons, lawyers, people who are in this area, who understand logic and reason and argumentation, to really push a new agenda forward and to help us develop an agenda. And also that's going to have to be with some partners, some allies. We're going to have allies who are completely on board, who are collaborators, and then we're going to have people who's just going to give us a hashtag and, give us a tweet, a retweet or something, and we'll take it. We're hoping we get more people who are actually going to put action in and not just retweet. We're hoping that there's going to be people coming to the table and who are willing to dispense the things that only benefit themselves to benefit others. Because at the end of the day, that's the crux here. People are putting themselves completely before anyone else at the expense of everyone else. If we want for our brothers and sisters what we want for ourselves, these things cannot happen. We can't be okay with these things if we see each other as human beings and we truly want for each other what we want for ourselves. So bringing all of the work back locally and coalescing into something bigger with our allies, I don't know of another way forward. Listening to Black leadership, listening to Black voices, deferring to Black voices on these issues. It's a necessity. And unfortunately, it has not happened yet.
Yeah, we have to partner with like-minded, right-minded people who have the same or similar vision that we have, and we can work together with people who are right-minded. Now, it takes a collective effort. It's going to take a collective effort to get to the goal that we're trying to get to. But as our prophet said, you see a wrong, you have to stop it with your hands. That means you have to act upon it. You have to put some action into it. And I know the Christian says faith without works is dead, right? So we have to act against the wrong. We can't act against it. We have to speak out against the wrong and at least say it's troubling in our hearts. And this is something that's doable, but it takes moral strength and courage in order for us to do it. And really, it really doesn't take a whole lot of people to do it. You just have to have a group of people who are like-minded and are not going to stop, that have the patience and perseverance to see it through to the end. We have to have that.
And since those who know me know that I'm all about food, I call it trying to set welcome tables in my life in various contexts. And what that means is creating a safe space so that people feel like they can really share what's on their heart. And I have to be of a spirit that I can accept something that's really whack that someone says, but hold the tension and just understand, I need to understand where they're coming from. They need to understand where I'm coming from. And at least if we may disagree after all of that, but at least we can get to the point where we hear each other and listen and recognize the divine in that other person, recognize their humanity. That gives us a real chance, I think, to make progress.
Thank you so much. Well, Imam Abdur-Rahim Ali, Adrian Miller, Dr. Nabeeh, Hassan, this has been an absolutely riveting conversation. The people have been engaged from the second that we started this conversation, and I think we can keep going on and talking about this. And I really thank you all for really sharing your truths with us, sharing your sentiments, sharing your aspirations, sharing your advice. I know that's quite a laboring process and in the midst of all that's going on. And so I really do thank you for all of that. And I know the viewers do as well. I'd like to turn it over to each of you to hear any closing thoughts that you might have to share before we conclude this session.
I'll just say, keep the faith. We've got a lot of work to do, but we can do it.
Beautiful.
Imam Ali.
We've been told in the Quran that let there arise out of you a band of people inviting to all that is good, forbidding what is wrong. And so, and we can't fear the criticism of the criticizers. You're gonna have criticizers. I don't care what you do, you're gonna always have that. That just comes with the territory. But let us strengthen our bond, particularly with those in the faith community and people who are right-minded and like-minded. And I think if we can do that, we can begin to strategize on how we can get some things done, and that we stay productive and produce. We have to produce. We just can't talk. We have to produce. And those who are in positions of leadership, we have to insist that they be productive. We have to see productivity. And that includes those who are in government. They don't produce, they have to go. Nothing personal, but you didn't produce, you gotta go. Anybody that's in leadership position, they have to produce. And if we love you, but you have to go because we have to have somebody that's gonna produce.
I would just say that the world is watching, and more importantly, the youth in our future is watching. And the moments that we take and step back and the things that we do right now directly determine what happens in the future. And so I hope and pray that each of us ponders and reflects day to day, moment to moment, is what I'm doing improving that future, or keeping it the same, or making it worse? And for whom would it improve, keep the same, or worse? And if you aren't troubled and saddened by what you may do hurting other people, inhibiting them from life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, or even worse, you don't care, you really need to do some deep soul searching. Because something inside of your soul, your spirit, your energy right now is off. If you don't appreciate the moment that we're in right now and have the deepest desire for change, check yourself. And I'd say that to myself before I say that to anyone.
Thank you. If I may just take a moment, I'd like to summarize our conversation here, since we began the conversation with our first panelist, Tamara Banks, and she's not here with us. And I do want to mention to the audience that Tay Anderson, who is a president, on the board of directors for the Denver Public Schools, was unable to join us because he was in the midst of some car issues, but all is good on his end. Please do follow his conversation that he's currently having now about the presence of police in schools and what does that mean for the Denver public school system. That's currently happening at his page. We definitely missed having Tay Anderson here with us. But for our audience, and you know, for me as a person who's found this as like a huge learning experience as well, this conversation really began about recognizing and acknowledging the fact that this has always been an issue. That racism and the history of police and the mindset that surrounds it has permeated from generation to generation, that has brought us to the moment that we are in today. And Tamara Banks really put into perspective with us, talking about the moment that we currently live in and the fact that there needs to be a movement out of this. And we were then joined in by Imam Abdur-Rahim Ali, who really talked about the root causes of racism and the need to acknowledge and address those root causes of racism, followed by Adrian Miller, who really put into perspective the pain and evil that surrounds aspects of racism, and the story and the reflections that you shared of your grandfather. That was extremely powerful. Followed by Dr. Nabeeh Hassan, who talked about responsibility and that only each and every one of us recognizing the responsibilities that we have can we really move to this form of aspiration. And in a lot of that you all have been sharing around allyship, the thing that has really rang true, and most importantly across the board, is that this is not a time to be silent. And there is certainly no need for any type of deafening silence. We all have a responsibility to play in all the different aspects of identities that we might carry. And to really kind of kick that off, we really need to have a sense of taking ownership. And that type of ownership means really recognizing, understanding how we've been racialized into society, whether it might be as a white individual, whether it might be as a person that is a non-white person of color, and recognizing the fact that the Black community in itself is not a monolith, and that there are different forms of aspiration. And the way to take that sense of ownership and to move forward is through education. It's through being an active member and involved in the voting process. And most importantly, it's about being physically present, whether it might be at the demonstrations and recognizing the privilege that you might carry there and the type of protections that you can offer through that, whether it's physical presence in terms of conversations that we could be having and you leveraging your privilege in terms of having those conversations around racism and the need to end it within your respective spaces. But most importantly, living through that responsibility, despite how uncomfortable it might be, how new it might be to some of us. And only through that can we really achieve that systemic change that we're really aspiring towards. Because what we're really talking about here is the influence of racism across the entire spectrum of the different systems that impact our daily lives. And through that, we can institute those institutional policies to end that. Did I best summarize that, or are there some aspects that I missed during that process? Okay, wonderful. Well, I would really like to, first off, thanking each of our panelists, Tamara Banks, who is not here with us. Thank you so much for really joining us at the beginning of the call. Adrian Miller, Imam Abdur-Rahim Ali, Dr. Nabeeh Hassan, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here with us. Hey, Anderson, we really thank you for taking this invitation, and it was, we're unfortunate not to have you here. Really do want to thank the Multicultural Mosaic Foundation for really hosting this conversation and really, taking responsibility in the sense of hosting that conversation, and to the sponsors of Interfaith Alliance, Colorado Council of Churches, the Oromo Community of Colorado, Colorado Muslim Speakers Bureau, the Colorado Imam Council, and Muslim Youth for Positive Impact, for really sponsoring this conversation and sharing it across their certain platforms. And on a final note, thank you to all of you for really welcoming me into this space. I hope that I was able to meet all of your expectations around moderation. It's been an absolute privilege, and I'm absolutely honored and humbled to have been able to moderate this conversation, and really do thank you all for all the continuous work that you all have continued to do. I've seen it myself. I have benefited from it, and really have an immense amount of gratitude and appreciation for all of it. And thank you to all of our viewers who really tuned in, and wishing everyone to be safe and be well in these very trying times.